Here's your engaging YouTube video introduction. The streets were quiet, the city buzzing with the usual rhythm of the afternoon. Cars rolled past, pedestrians hurried along, and everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. Senator Marcus Reed had just finished a meeting downtown and was on his way home when flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was just a routine stop, maybe a broken taillight, a minor traffic violation, but as soon as the officer approached, something felt off. The energy, the tone, the look in his eyes. "License and registration," the officer barked. His stance was rigid, his voice carrying an unnecessary edge. Marcus, always calm under pressure, complied without hesitation. But the officer wasn't interested in routine. He seemed more focused on something else, something deeper. "You driving this car?" the officer asked, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Marcus had seen this play out before, countless stories, familiar patterns. He could feel the tension rise as the officer's questions became more pointed, his attitude more aggressive. It was clear this wasn't just about a traffic stop. Despite his patience, Marcus knew where this was headed. He tried to explain who he was, but the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he smirked, as if enjoying the moment. A man used to power, used to control. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly predict, was that the universe has a way of balancing the scales. And karma. Karma was about to strike in a way no one saw coming. 7 minutes. That's all it took. 7 minutes from arrogance to realization. 7 minutes from power to panic. Because just when the officer thought he had the upper hand, reality hit hard, and in an instant, everything changed. What happened next? Well, let's just say, the world has a way of making things right, and this was a moment he would never forget. Stay tuned. Marcus sat still, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. He had been through tough situations before, political battles, heated debates, moments where every word mattered, but this was different. This wasn't about policy or public service. This was personal. The officer stood there, flipping through Marcus's documents with an exaggerated slowness, like he was searching for something, anything, to justify what was happening. The way he glanced between the paperwork and Marcus, the way his hand rested just a little too close to his holster, spoke volumes. "You from around here?" the officer asked, though he already had Marcus' address in his hands. Marcus took a measured breath. "Born and raised," he answered, his voice steady. The officer nodded slowly, as if processing that information, as if deciding what to do next. "This your car?" Marcus exhaled through his nose. There it was again, the assumption, the doubt. The officer wasn't asking because he needed confirmation. He was asking because he didn't believe it. "Yes," Marcus replied, keeping his tone even. The officer took a step back, looking over the sleek black vehicle, then back at Marcus. "Nice ride," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Traffic continued to pass, drivers barely noticing the scene unfolding on the side of the road. Pedestrians walked by, some glancing over, but no one stopped. To them, it was just another routine stop. But Marcus knew better. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered. Marcus hesitated. "Is there a reason for that?" The officer's expression flickered, just for a second. Annoyance? Frustration? He recovered quickly, his stance stiffening. "I gave you an order." Marcus could feel his pulse quicken, but he wasn't about to lose his composure. He had spent years navigating tense situations, staying cool under pressure. He wasn't about to let this man rattle him. "Am I being detained?" he asked, his voice firm but controlled. The officer tilted his head slightly, as if he hadn't expected that question. The power dynamic was shifting, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in the officer's eyes. "Just step out of the car," he repeated, but this time there was less bite in his tone. Marcus didn't move. The air between them grew heavier, thick with unspoken words, silent calculations. The officer glanced around, as if checking to see who was watching. Maybe he was starting to realize that he had pushed too far. Then, in the distance, another car approached, its tinted windows rolling down. A voice called out, one that changed everything. And in that moment, the officer's confidence wavered, because karma was coming, and it was coming fast. The officer's posture stiffened as the car rolled to a slow stop a few feet away. The engine hummed quietly, its presence impossible to ignore. The tinted window slid down just enough to reveal a pair of sharp, watchful eyes. Someone was paying attention now. Someone who wasn't just passing by. Marcus didn't have to turn his head to feel a shift in energy. He could sense it. Something had changed. The officer must have felt it too because, for the first time, hesitation flickered across his face. His fingers twitched at his belt, as if deciding his next move. "You got a problem here, officer." The voice from the car was calm, but there was an undeniable weight to it. It wasn't aggressive, just knowing. Like whoever was in that car understood exactly what was happening. The officer cleared his throat, glancing between Marcus and the mystery driver. "This is a routine stop," he said, but the confidence he had just moments ago was slipping. A pause stretched between them. The air felt charged, as if an invisible force was pressing down on the scene. "You sure about that?" the voice asked again. The officer squared his shoulders, trying to regain his footing. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please move along." Silence. Then, slowly, the door of the car swung open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with quiet authority. Even before he spoke again, it was clear he wasn't just anybody. That's when Marcus saw the glint of a badge clipped to his belt. Not a police badge, though. Something else. Something higher. The officer saw it too, and for the first time, real tension crept into his features. His hands moved away from his belt. His stance softened just slightly. "Senator Reed," the man said, addressing Marcus directly. His tone was respectful, familiar. "Everything okay here?" Marcus finally turned his head, taking in the man's face. Recognition flashed through him. He knew exactly who this was. "Just a misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice even. The officer exhaled sharply, shifting uncomfortably. He glanced at the man, then at Marcus, then back again. It was clear he was calculating his next move. He had started this encounter in control, certain that his authority would be enough to dictate the situation. But now the dynamic had shifted, because Marcus wasn't just another man on the road, and the person who had just stepped out of that car wasn't someone to be ignored. The officer's jaw tightened. He wasn't ready to back down, not yet. But whether he liked it or not, things were no longer in his hands. And karma was just getting started. The officer's eyes darted between Marcus and the man standing beside the car. His jaw was tight, his fingers flexing slightly at his side. The weight of the moment was pressing down, but he wasn't ready to admit he had lost control. Not yet. Marcus could see it, the stubbornness, the refusal to acknowledge the shift in power. He had seen this kind of resistance before, the kind that refused to bend even when the truth was staring it in the face. The officer had started this encounter sure of himself, sure that he held all the authority. But now, with each passing second, that certainty was slipping away. The man from the car took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on the officer. His presence alone changed everything. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't threatening, but there was something in the way he carried himself that demanded respect. "Officer," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm, "I'd like to know exactly why Senator Reed was stopped." The officer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Like I said, just a routine stop." "A routine stop," the man repeated, as if weighing the words. He glanced at Marcus, then back at the officer. "That's interesting, considering the way you've handled it." Marcus could see the officer's frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He was losing ground, and he knew it. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Sir, I don't need to explain myself to you. the officer said, his voice tightening. "I was just doing my job." The man nodded slightly, as if he expected that response. He reached into his coat, pulling out a sleek black wallet. When he flipped it open, the shine of his credentials caught the light. The officer's expression barely changed, but Marcus caught the subtle shift, the flicker of recognition, the slight stiffening of his shoulders. "I understand," the man said, his tone unchanged. "And I'm doing mine." For the first time, real tension filled the space. The officer's face reddened slightly. His breathing was steady, but his eyes were scanning, calculating. Marcus remained quiet, watching it all unfold. He knew what was coming. He could feel it. The moment where everything snapped into place, where the truth would no longer be avoidable. The officer exhaled sharply, his hand twitching at his side. His confidence was slipping, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Not yet. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then, suddenly, a voice crackled through the officer's radio. And in an instant, the final piece of karma fell into place. The officer's radio crackled again, louder this time, cutting through the thick silence. A voice on the other end, sharp and urgent. "Unit 4 to 7 report. You need to clear that stop immediately. We have a situation." The officer hesitated, gripping the radio. He brought it to his mouth, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. "Dispatch, I'm handling something here." A pause. Then the response came firmer. "Negative, officer. You need to clear that stop. Now." The man standing beside Marcus's car didn't move, but his expression shifted ever so slightly. He had heard it too. Something was happening, something bigger than whatever power play this officer thought he was making. Marcus could see the conflict in the officer's face. He wanted to keep his ground, wanted to prove a point, but whatever was on that radio had shaken him. His fingers tightened around the device before he reluctantly clicked it back onto his vest. And then, just when it seemed like the tension had hit its peak, another car pulled up. This one was moving fast, deliberate. It skidded slightly as it stopped just behind the officer's patrol car, and the doors flew open almost immediately. 2 more officers stepped out, but these weren't just any officers. Their uniforms were different, marked with insignias that carried more weight. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the situation quickly before landing on Marcus, and then the man standing beside him. One of them spoke first, his voice controlled but urgent. "Senator Reed, are you all right?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I'm fine." The first officer, the one who had initiated the stop, stiffened. He looked between the new arrivals and the man who had stepped out of the car earlier. Realization was hitting him, piece by piece, but he wasn't ready to accept it yet. One of the newly arrived officers turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Step aside, now." The officer's jaw clenched. "I said step aside," the officer repeated, firmer this time. A heavy silence followed. The first officer's face was burning now, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His pride, his control, it was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. Then the man beside Marcus, the one with the black wallet and undeniable authority, finally spoke again. "I think you've done enough for one day, officer." The words hung in the air, final and absolute. And just like that, the balance of power shifted completely. But what none of them knew yet, what even Marcus hadn't realized, was that the real twist was still coming. Because karma wasn't just about balance. It was about justice, and justice wasn't done yet. The officer's face was frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, his mind clearly racing to find a way out of the mess he had created. But there was no way out now. The moment had slipped from his grasp, and he knew it. The 2 newly arrived officers stepped forward, their presence commanding. One of them turned to Marcus and the man beside him. "Apologies for the delay, Senator Reed. We were just made aware of this situation." His eyes flicked toward the first officer, the weight of unspoken consequences hanging in the air. The first officer shifted his stance. I was just doing my job, he stammered, but the excuse felt weak even as he said it. His confidence was gone. The arrogance, the control, it had all drained from him the moment those doors opened. The man with the black wallet, still standing calm and composed, let out a slow breath. Your job, he repeated, his voice unreadable. Tell me, officer, is it standard procedure to escalate a simple traffic stop for no reason? The officer didn't answer. He couldn't. Then, as if the universe itself wanted to drive the final nail in, the radio crackled to life again. Unit 4 to 7, return to the station immediately. We need you in for questioning. Silence. The first officer's eyes darted to his radio, his face turning a shade paler. Marcus saw it, the understanding creeping in. This wasn't just about this one moment anymore. Something bigger was at play. The second officer finally spoke again. Hand over your badge and weapon. The first officer's breath hitched. Wait. Now. For the longest moment, he didn't move. He was still gripping the belt at his waist, fingers twitching slightly. It was the last shred of power he had left, but he knew. He knew it was over. Slowly, his hand went to his belt, unhooking the badge. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as he placed it into the waiting officer's hand. Then, reluctantly, he unfastened his holster and handed over his weapon. A finality settled over the moment. Marcus exhaled, his body finally relaxing, but just as the tension seemed to lift, the officer let out a short, humorless laugh. It was bitter, filled with something almost like disbelief. You think this is over? He muttered, shaking his head slightly. Marcus narrowed his eyes. The man wasn't looking at him anymore. He wasn't looking at anyone, just staring off, as if processing something deeper. Then, under his breath, he said it, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. You have no idea who I work for. And just like that, the air shifted again, because this wasn't over, not even close backslash. Marcus felt a chill run through him at the officer's words, but he didn't let it show. He had spent years in politics, navigating power struggles, seeing how corruption worked from the inside. This wasn't new. The officer might have been stripped of his badge, but his words carried weight. They hinted at something bigger, something unseen. The two higher-ranking officers exchanged a glance. They had heard it too. But for now, the priority was closing out this situation. The officer was led away toward the second patrol car, his steps slow, shoulders tense. Even as he climbed into the back seat, he never once looked at Marcus. Instead, his gaze stayed fixed ahead, jaw clenched. Marcus let out a long breath, shaking off the lingering unease. The man who had come to his aid, the one with the black wallet and quiet authority, turned to him. You all right, Senator? Marcus nodded. I will be. The man studied him for a moment, then gave a small, understanding nod. This isn't the first time, is it? Marcus smirked slightly, though there was no humor in it, and probably won't be the last. The man exhaled, glancing back at the patrol car as it pulled away. Maybe not, he admitted, but today the right person was watching. Marcus looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in the entire encounter, he felt something close to relief. Because despite everything, despite the frustration, the tension, the subtle power plays, someone had stepped in. Someone had made sure justice was served. As Marcus got back into his car, he took one last look in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was clear, but he knew that didn't mean the fight was over. It never really was. But today, at least, karma had done its job, and for now, that was enough.